Hello book lovers, thanks for joining us on this episode as we gear up for the Marlborough Book Festival 2024. Experience the magic of words and wonder from the evening of July 25 through to Sunday, July 28. For more details and to stay informed, head over to the marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. For now, please enjoy this session from the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this first session today of the Marlborough Book Festival, Jumping Sundays. I'm Laura from Cloudy Bay Wines. It's a pleasure for us to be here and supporting the book festival here in Blenheim. And I'm sure you'll agree that the festival team has done a wonderful job of putting together such a diverse range of sessions, topics and stories this weekend, that whether you're just here for this session or you're going to attend some more over the weekend and perhaps attended last night's wonderful opening, you're certainly in for a treat. But would love to introduce Robbie Burton. So Robbie will be introducing Nick Bollinger, and they will be talking today on the Jumping Sunday session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Tēnā koutou, ina mana, ina waka, ina iwi, o te motu, kei te mihi o ki te mana whenua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to you all. It's really great to be here and to see such a crowd. So Nick is a writer, a broadcaster and a critic. And though he doesn't advertise this, he's actually also a superb musician. I suspect he's best known really for his music criticism via the column he had in The Listener for over 20 years, and also for his regular weekly gig on RNZ, The Sampler, which for me always stood out for its elegance and erudition, really. And it was no surprise, really, that Nick has moved into writing books, which he's been doing in recent years. He did the creative non-fiction program at the IML in Wellington, and he published his excellent memoir, Gonville. If you haven't read that, you should. And now, last year, just about a year ago, he published Jumping Sundays, which is the book that we're here to talk about today. So we're going to start with a reading from the prologue because it's a really good way, I think, of setting the scene. Sure. So off you go, Nick.
Yeah. This is how it begins. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1969, thousands of people defied Auckland city bylaws and came to party in Albert Park. A rock band played on the rotunda. Some people held hands. Some danced alone. Some sat under trees with guitars, flutes and bongos and made music of their own. They wore caftans, ponchos and leather-fringed jerkins, floppy hats, headbands, beads and flowers. Poetry and political diatribes were delivered from a podium, improvised from an upturned tea chest. There were bikies, balloons, bubbles, sack races and a lolly scramble, lots of dogs and a pet possum. Someone brought a canoe and paddled it around the fountain until it capsized. As the afternoon wore on, there were joss sticks, skyrockets, and what some will have recognised as the musky smell of marijuana. It wasn't the first gathering of this kind in New Zealand, but it was up to this point easily the biggest. Here, on a seemingly vast scale, people who'd been variously labelled as hippies, freaks, weirdies, radicals and dropouts were able to see and celebrate with a great many others who looked and acted a lot like they did. For those watching from the sidelines or looking at newspaper photos in the days that followed, the effect was quite the opposite. The revellers were a strange group whose lives, looks, beliefs and aspirations were evidently not only very different from their own, but also a challenge to post-war New Zealand's social norms. Jumping Sundays, as the weekly Albert Park gatherings became known, had their origins in another park, another Sunday, just a few blocks away on the upper slopes of Queen Street. Myers Park was the only place in Auckland where it was legally permitted to lecture or preach, play musical instruments, dance, or assemble to partake in any of the above. In the late 60s, much of the activity in Myers Park had centred on the war in Vietnam. Protesters waved placards. Speakers decried New Zealand's involvement in the war and its powerful American allies. One group staged a hunger strike in support of an imprisoned protester and stayed in the park for several days. But while opposition to the war was earnest, a distinguishing feature of this new kind of protest was the idea that such causes could and should be fought in a spirit of mischief and fun. Along with politics, there would be songs, dancing, poetry and theatre. For some of the participants, most of whom were in their teens and early 20s, the politics were almost immaterial. Underlying it all was the idea that the world was on the brink of a momentous change, and this was a way to be part of it. The Myers Park gatherings have been gaining force through the year. At first, just a handful, then hundreds came, and soon the crowds had outgrown the venue. The players and dancers felt constrained by the park's steep, narrow slopes. And there was the principle of free speech. Shouldn't you be able to speak your mind whenever and wherever you liked? The limits on gatherings were draconian and had to be challenged. So one Sunday, with little planning and no advance publicity, a group of several hundred left Myers Park and set off down the middle of Queen Street. The musicians carried their instruments, which included an iron-framed upright piano. The small number of police on duty in the city that day were taken by surprise. Assuming the marchers were headed for the United States Consulate in Customs Street, the site of several previous demonstrations, they hastily arranged a cordon at the bottom of Queen Street, but the marchers never reached it. Instead, they made a right turn in the direction of the much larger Albert Park, just across from the University of Auckland campus. A taxi driver picking up the police on his CB radio heard an agitated official exclaim, "But Sergeant, 300 people can't just disappear." Albert Park was liberated. For the rest of that Sunday and every other Sunday that year, the crowds would gather there. There was no conventional advertising, no notices in the paper or jingles on the radio, just word of mouth and a few Gestetner-printed flyers distributed around the streets. With each weekend, the numbers grew, while police stood by with the onlookers. Among the guardians of law and order, the consensus seemed to be that youth rebellion would be reluctantly tolerated as long as it was confined to Sunday afternoons. Well, that's not exactly what happened, but,
Nice one.
That's where it begins.
Yeah. At risk of sounding like a pedant, I actually think it would be really interesting to hear your take on what you actually think the counterculture was in Aotearoa. Like, what were its characteristics? What are actually we talking about here in terms of this session today? Yeah,
it's a very good place to start. And I chose to open the book with that vignette of the liberation of Albert Park because that did seem to, that event, it wasn't the beginning of the counterculture, but it did bring together a lot of strands that had already been loosely sort of running through, in currents through New Zealand society, I think. In a nutshell, the counterculture was the baby boomers, I suppose you call them, post-war children coming of age in the 1960s, looking at the world they were stepping into and inheriting, and taking issue with a lot of it, questioning the things that their parents and their parents' generation took for granted. It was at such a different time. Their parents had lived through a war, they'd lived through austerity. I think that, they are sometimes referred to as the silent generation, that pre-war generation. And in a way, silence is sort of what a lot of them wanted. They didn't want another depression. They didn't want another war. They were quite happy to have a home in the suburbs and enjoy some relative prosperity. And I think they were also trying to provide for their children, and to their surprise, a lot of what they were offering, a lot of things that actually seemed like real social improvements, such as, university became a far more attainable goal for, a lot of these boomers were the first generation of their families to go to university and things. But a lot of the things that their parents stood for were soundly rejected. Things like the notion of going to war. And throughout the 60s, we had the build-up of the Vietnam War. So there were other things too. We can sort of enumerate them. And in a way, I've sort of devoted a chapter to each of them in the book. Domestic life, the idea of the nuclear family, that was challenged. You had the idea of, initially young groups, sometimes students, sometimes dropouts, male and female, living together, setting up their own households. And then within that, things will become even more fluid. And it developed into people actually setting up larger communities, sometimes leaving the cities altogether and going out and even building their own homes out in the bush or in tracts of land. So these things were new ideas, or they were certainly, some had, everything has antecedents, and there were some outliers in previous generations who had done some of these things. Of course, there'd been an anti-war movement. Before the war, there had been even the odd commune or intentional community that had been set up. But this was something like a mass movement, I suppose. There were, and it wasn't a majority even of baby boomers that were involved in this, but it was a significant enough number that society couldn't ignore it. It was noticed.
Yeah. And Nick, you state in the book that, as we will discuss later on, you were possibly a little bit old to be right at the heart of young. Sorry, it's the wrong way. Young, sorry. He's not 90. Young. We
were all young.
We were all young. But you obviously had some sort of fascination with it, which has led you to want to write this book. You write that you were really interested. It had quite a profound influence on you, as I understand it, and you were really interested to see what it was really, and what shape it was. Is that right? So is that
absolutely.
What motivated you? Yeah,
I would say that above all, writing the book was my way of understanding this thing that was going on that looked very exciting to me at the time, and the ideas were fascinating. But I was a school kid, really, through that entire period. And I could see that there were people just a few years older than me who were doing interesting things. And I was coming up through schools that were pretty conservative, and it was very clear that there were two New Zealands here. There was a mainstream where you were, expected to go through these various steps and end up on some sort of career path. And then there were people who were challenging that, and that looked much more interesting to me. My own background, my parents were actually, they were too old to be part of the counterculture, really, but they were...
But if they'd been young enough, they would have been right into it. They're not.
Yeah, and in a way, I can see that they were kind of, in their different ways, were helping to kind of forge a path for it. At one point, they were... they had been in... My father, he was just a bit too young to be called up for the military in the Second World War, but he'd actually been at Wellington College. He'd boycotted cadets. He was already a sort of conscientious objector in principle, I think. So, and he carried on being involved in political movements, and he was quite involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and the anti-apartheid movement too. And my mother came from she was a refugee, Jewish refugee, but her parents had been involved in the arts in Berlin in the pre-war era. So she had that sensibility. So in a way it was a semi-countercultural. It was certainly, again, I was growing up in an environment that was sort of a bit at odds with mainstream New Zealand, and I was sort of right for the picking, really.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's one of the really interesting, in terms of where the counterculture came from. I mean, I didn't really get that, but it seemed that the role of protest was huge, actually. And you quote an English writer that it was the bomb that created the counterculture. And that seems to be very clear now. The kind of the sense that young people were incapable of managing a life without a future, and that the whole rise of C&D and all the other sorts of groups that emerged seemed to me to be, the sense that we've got to push against the establishment was very strong. Protest runs right through the book, doesn't it?
It does.
In terms of in all its various ways. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think so. And I sort of allude to it in the bit I read about Myers Park and Albert Park, that it was different kinds of protest, and anything could be a protest. Of course you were protesting against nuclear weapons or Vietnam War or apartheid in South Africa, and these were serious life and death issues, but you were also protesting about the fact that men weren't allowed to grow their hair long at school, or or even at work. People were ordered to cut their hair and wear a collar and tie, and all these things were seen as infringements on people's liberties, or premarital sex. Or in a country which had an ingrained alcohol culture, you could be put in jail for smoking marijuana. So, in a way, the whole lifestyle, the countercultural lifestyle, was a protest.
Yeah. Which was a huge attraction. Yeah,
and it was glamorous in a way as well. Yeah, because it did promise fun. This was above all in a society that was fairly, you'd have to say, conservative. And I mean, the reason I call it Jumping Sundays, because that had lots of resonances for me. I mean, those gatherings in the park, they did name them Jumping Sundays, but actually the idea that until the late 60s or even later, I mean, Sundays, what do people do in New Zealand? They'd mow their lawns, they'd paint the fence. Sundays did not jump. They were the shops were closed. Maybe people went to church. I mean, that was something else.
Well,
religion is another thing, actually, that was challenged during the period. And it wasn't entirely rejected, but it was sort of replaced. I mean, you did get this plethora of exotic belief systems that were suddenly being tried out. And that was another kind of rebellion.
In the protest vein, why don't you read us the bit about John Bower, which is a fascinating kind of incident, really.
Yeah, so we're moving on. This is a couple of years after the liberation of Albert Park, and you've had protests taking place from the mid-60s all the way through, and they started off fairly benign. I think the most radical thing or sort of challenging thing that was done in the mid-60s was some students chained themselves to the fence outside Parliament grounds. But some people were starting to think that this wasn't enough. And this is, I suppose the only thing you need to know here is that there'd been a series of visits to New Zealand by American dignitaries, basically courting the New Zealand government to try and get them to step up their involvement in Vietnam, their commitment to the Vietnam War. And the latest one to come was Spiro Agnew, who had come with an astronaut. He'd brought an astronaut with him. We'd just had the moon landing. And it was a particularly hot and sticky Auckland summer. The demonstrations went ahead as planned and were the most violent New Zealand had seen since the country's involvement in Vietnam began. They commenced as soon as the Vice President arrived for his 3-day visit on Thursday, the 15th of January, 1971. Things came to a head late on the second night as demonstrators maintained their noisy vigil outside the Hotel Intercontinental. By breaking their slogan of 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your bloody war, into a stereo call and response chant, they were able to sustain a continuous racket. So one lot would go 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your bloody war, and they never ran out of breath. But while the 500 or so protesters showed little sign of flagging, 100 or more cops were getting tired and testy. At around 11:45 p.m, an observer saw police approach a few in the front of the crowd, as they'd been doing from time to time throughout the evening. Only a handful of the demonstrators would have been able to see the interaction or hear what was said. Almost immediately afterwards, a wall of police charged into the crowd, the majority of whom were still seated on the footpath in a tightly packed mass. John Bauer was among that crowd. As he remembers it, the cops got upset and just waded in. Basically, the cops beat us up, just went mad. I don't know who was in command. Obviously, they were getting it in the neck because the noise was carrying on. Demonstrators were forced into nearby Albert Park, yet even after they'd been dispersed, a small number of constables, according to a journalist, perhaps 6 or 7, pursued them into the trees, still assaulting them. Bauer was among them. He was helping another protester, Janet Neville, escape over a fence when he was set upon, knocked to the ground and beaten. In the days that followed, a committee of concerned citizens was formed to lobby for a public inquiry to establish whether or not the common expectation of freedom from undue or arbitrary violence by the police had been eroded. John Bauer would respond in his own way. In the small hours of the first Sunday in March, Alan Brunton, poet, performer, existentialist, was walking home through Parnell. He'd just come from a party in Remuera Road for his future partner Sally Rodwell, and he'd given her Let It Bleed, the latest Rolling Stones album. A totally radical record for its time, as he would say. It was physical, it was sexual, it was biological. It had been a great party, and he was feeling high in every sense. I was a totally happy person that night, he said. I felt some sort of achievement about my life. He'd just walked through Newmarket down Parnhill Road, just past the Hearst chocolate factory, and was approaching his flat, when suddenly up the rise came several speeding police vehicles, lights flashing. They screeched to a halt beside Brunton. He was immediately jumpy, hoping there was nothing in his pockets. A primal fear. A few grams of marijuana could mean 6 months in prison. Out of dark vans came police with torches and dogs. The dogs are crawling all over me, he recalled. I'm thrashed to the wall, hands up against the wall, top to bottom searched. They're yelling and screaming something at me I don't recognise. I had no idea where they came from, what they wanted, what on earth was going on. Then, as suddenly as they arrived, they were gone. Arriving home, Brunton's flatmates told him there'd been an explosion that evening at the RNZA base in Fox Street, just a few blocks away. At the scene of the explosion, police had found a note which read, "This bombing is one of the initial steps in a plan to render the military establishment incapable of continuing its immoral war in Vietnam. We intend to increase our action against more military bases until the government withdraws its troops from Vietnam." Signed, Revolutionary Activists. The police contacted the SIS with a view to establishing the identity of the revolutionary activists, but the service was unable to assist. It was 5 months before John Bauer appeared in court, charged with damaging the Fox Street Air Force No. 1 port depot by means of an explosive. He was also charged with a failed attempt to blow up the Army's No. 6 magazine at Ardmore, just southeast of the city. In evidence, the detective read the note found under the door of the depot, purportedly bearing Bauer's fingerprints. There had been no one there at the time of the explosion. The only equipment damaged was a pair of old Singer sewing machines valued at $10 and $14, held in storage pending transit to Fiji. In sentencing, Justice Beattie told Bauer, "It is one thing to express dissent by words or proper demonstrations, but we will not tolerate violence. You take no warning, you show resentment towards authority." He sentenced Bauer to 4 years imprisonment. He would serve much of it in the maximum security block at Paramariwa.
Well, sort of almost quaint, isn't it, that someone should, think a revolution was going to start that way. But so, what were the main threads of the protest movement then, sort of after? I mean, obviously the Vietnam War was huge, wasn't it? That's what I remember. Yeah.
Well, there was the growing feeling about apartheid in South Africa, which had actually started long before the Vietnam War. I mean, that was, in some ways, that picked up speed once the Vietnam War had sort of ended, But okay, the other threads of the protest movement. The anti-nuclear thing
was huge, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the bomb before, and it was a sort of an existential threat that it created the whole climate in which I think young people went, this world that we're inheriting is actually crazy. This generation that preceded us have created, for the first time ever, have created the means to destroy the entire planet. And this is a new thing, and it doesn't make sense to us, and we reject it. And at the same time, I think that was the sort of, whether it was articulated by every one of those counterculturists or not, I think it was the underlying mood that sort of gave rise to all these other things, and they started looking around and going, we reject that as well. Why shouldn't we have premarital sex? Why shouldn't we take LSD? Some of these things were worth, you could say, some of these things were more worth challenging than others, perhaps. I don't know.
I mean, that's the whole other thing that's beautifully described in this book, is all the kind of cultural stuff, of course, that which is a huge feature of the counterculture, wasn't it? Was the sense of otherness that young people especially were able to generate by what they wore and what they listened to. I mean, music was huge, wasn't it?
There were things that...
I was really interested in that, because it seemed to me that I hadn't quite realised that really, arguably, the counterculture started, in fact, with musically, their interest with jazz and folk music, really, which I don't know, because of my age, I suppose, I just thought it was rock music, but not at all. It was, Is that fair? Yeah.
Well, certainly on the campuses, and I mean, the counterculture had a voice on the universities were certainly hubs for countercultural activity. A lot of the protests started there. And it also, as the 60s went on, they became, and certainly into the 70s, they became really the kind of main venue for alternative music, for the sort of soundtrack of the counterculture. You weren't going to hear bands playing Street Fighting Man or Four Dead in Ohio in a booze barn. That wasn't where that music lived. It lived primarily on the university campuses. And in the early 60s, there was the University Jazz Club, certainly in Wellington, I think in Auckland too. There was the University Folk Club. And of course, folk music, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, they were the sort of figureheads, the protest figureheads of the counterculture. They actually sang songs about these things that people were going out and protesting about.
Yeah. One of the just switching focuses that fascinated me about the book is that we all, I'm sure, have our own lenses on what the counterculture meant. And for me, if you had asked me about the counterculture, for me it was back to the land.
Yeah.
It was, communes and the whole Earth catalogue and all of that stuff. And it's fascinating because that gets relatively little coverage in Jumping Sundays, That was one of the things that I was fascinated by the book, because there was all this other stuff that I hadn't really sort of put together. But it's and certainly if I was to think about the naivety of that people think of the counterculture, it's communes is possibly one of the big ones. I mean, they mostly didn't work.
I certainly deal with the communes. I had to condense it because you could write a whole book about that, and in fact, there is a book coming out later this year by a woman called Olive Jones, who I drew on some of her work in this as well. Yeah. She came and spoke at a symposium on counterculture that I organised in Wellington, which was also a great way of sort of gathering material.
Yeah.
It had to be really condensed.
Yeah.
And I certainly didn't cover it in great detail, but you couldn't write a book on the counterculture without talking about James K. Baxter and the Jerusalem commune. That was that was actually quite an early one, and then the Ohu scheme. Where did people know about this? One thing I was interested in was how did the New Zealand counterculture differ from, what was happening in America or Europe? What was our version of it? Because a lot of it was obviously being influenced by things happening overseas. But the Ohu scheme was unheard of. This was the government, and this was the short-lived Labour government, 72 to 75, Norman Kirk's government, picking up on the fact that young people were starting communes and were wanting to go back to the land, and going, well, we could make some Crown land available for them to do this. And there were 40 or 50 of these things actually started. What happened, and I've got a sort of case study of one, was that these were generally young urbanites with romantic visions of living off the land, going sort of up the river and realising that all they'd brought with them was some marijuana seedlings and a box of matches, and it wasn't going to be enough. And a lot of these places foundered, and also the land wasn't very good, and the scheme was virtually sabotaged from within. Kirk was he completely got it. I mean, there's statements that he made to show that, he said, these kids, they're anti-materialist. I think this is good. He approved of their values. And so did Mati Urata, who I think saw it really as a Pākehā embrace, a predominantly Pākehā embrace of Māoritanga. He went, this is tribal, and this is living in harmony with the environment, and this is to be encouraged.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that fascinated me about the book, which again was not something that I had in my head, was that the subtitle is The Rise and Fall of the Counterculture. And your contention really is that by 1975, people were already talking about it in the past tense, in terms of the sense that this actually, this movement was already petering out, which as a young man was just leaving school in 1975, and my life was completely shaped by the counterculture. It's not how I saw it. I could see other things were not happening, but it's a fascinating, made really thought-provoking sort of take on it. So tell us why you think, why you chose to subtitle it like that, The Rise and Fall of the Counterculture.
Yeah. Well, it had to have an end. The book had to have an ending. I think by the mid-70s, and I think we're about the same age, and I was leaving school then too. And like you, very much feeling as if I'm stepping into this world that's being shaped by this new thinking, and it's going to be great. And it kind of wasn't really. 1975, a whole lot of things happened. Muldoon was elected.
Yep.
So this brief window where you had Kirk actually embracing some of these countercultural things. Like, I mean, not only was there the Ohu scheme, there was also, he cancelled a South African sports tour. He just said, no, we're not.
Marlborough. Yeah, sent the frigate to Marlborough.
He sent the frigate to Marlborough, yeah. So all these things that had been radical countercultural movements through the 60s, it looked like they were actually going to come to fruition. These cries had been heard. Then in came Muldoon, who wasn't going to have any of that. He didn't want communes, dirty hippie dropouts. He actually punched a protester at one. I think they were picketing outside I think it was a meeting of of landlords, I think. It was like some sort of property thing, and Muldoon was speaking to them, and there were people protesting outside, and he threw a punch. So that was where he was coming from. So it was clear at that point that the counterculture hadn't exactly won the hearts and minds of the whole society. You also had this very destructive effect of the beginnings of this Mr. Asia drug ring. You'd had this very benign, I think, cannabis culture, which had sort of been, actually people were far less likely to have punch-ups if they were a bit stoned on grass than if they'd been drinking down at the pub, So this was all sort of went quite well with the dancing hippies and the saving the planet. But then, the heroin had a completely different effect on people. I think it isolated people. In some ways, you could say it was the most countercultural drug because it actually completely withdrew people from society. But it was also, it had a divisive effect. I talked to people in the protest movement who said, they decided they had to make a choice between being arrested for drugs or being arrested as a protester, and they thought, no, I'm not going to waste my time being arrested for drugs. That's going to be that's a silly thing, it's a frivolous thing. So yes, I suppose the fall in the end wasn't the end of any of these movements as such, but they ceased to be a mass movement. I think what happened was people with particular interests tended to split off from this mass movement and sort of plough their own furrow. I mean, one example would be the women's movement, which really emerged in the early 70s, women's liberation. And it was up until then, I think, I think there was a sort of realization that the inequalities that women were experiencing in the society could only be addressed by an individual movement. The counterculture had actually been dominated by male voices, and women weren't going to see justice if they just hung in with these hippies who tended to relegate the women to the kitchen or washing the nappies or feeding the children while they went up the mountaintops and meditated and
made the most of free love
to God and established their harems. So
yeah. But clearly, that's the influence is carried on. I mean, what what was counterculture in 1970, so much of it is mainstream now, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And around that time where, the mid-70s where I observed this change, a lot of very positive things about the counterculture actually were starting to be accepted by the wider public. I mean, the environmental movement is one of those things that even though when the counterculture likes to claim it, they weren't entirely responsible for it, but what had been seen as a rather fringe belief, the Marlborough campaign, which was really seeped into mainstream New Zealand, suddenly...
But that wasn't started by hippies.
It wasn't started by hippies, but the hippies...
Embraced it.
It was compatible with the sort of back to the land movement, and it actually was this mainstream thing. What else?
And certainly by the 1980s, when I was personally involved, it was mostly dirty hippies. Most of us were actually, driving it, but got a whole lot of mainstream support.
Yeah. And just some of those more ephemeral things, but that had actually been a real battle. I think they stopped telling kids they had to cut their hair at school and things by the late 70s, and they were even sort of growing moustaches in the police force and things like that.
Yeah, and caning was, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, it really did change, isn't it? I mean, the whole embracement of the sort of wellness movement and organic gardening and all the stuff that it's very real now. It's very much part of what we are.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about going to an Ambassador festival in the very late 70s, which on one hand it was like, here is the counterculture all sort of wrapped up, but at the same time, it struck me it's a bit like an A&P show or something. It was a kind of just come and try these things out, and it certainly wasn't. It had reached the broader public. Everyone was going along for a look, and
you make the observation that too was a more away from a sense of collectiveness. Collective, what's the word? But through to the rise of individualism was sort of...
Well, that finished it off. Yeah. I mean, in the 80s, you got that fourth Labour government. Certainly, you saw the destruction of trade unions. I think you could also see the beginnings of that, even in some of these sort of the separating of the strands of the counterculture. It wasn't so much a movement anymore. It was people going, this is my, I'm going to go on my own self-improvement journey. Rather than we're a collective and together we're going to change society.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I reckon it's time for some questions. We're mowing through the time. So we've got roving mics, and if you've got any questions, please wait for one, would be great. Has anyone got anything they'd like to ask, Nick? Or
we've covered it all.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks very much, Nick, for your book. I was very impressed in terms of the breadth of subjects you covered in it, trying to synthesize everything and all the research that you did, obviously personal interviews through to looking at previous accounts of what happened.
Thanks.
Just going back to Robbie's question about kind of the communes, there was kind of a big movement in Golden Bay, the rural resettlement movement that was spearheaded by Philip Williston in the end, who was very articulate in terms of trying to provide changes to planning things that allowed subdivisions so that people could move back into the rural environment. And he obviously went on to be a MP and minister and so on. But so there was people who came out of that movement who got into the real mainstream society and affected quite a lot of change in that way as well.
For the countercultural
John Bauer's legacy, is it? I just think maybe to finish off the response to Robbie's question, I finished reading your book just after midnight last night, so I just thought maybe you could read a few paragraphs at the end, just to try and gel just what you were touching on before of how it's now kind of been taken over by a lot of elements or got into the mainstream, a lot of elements of what you were talking about. But just before that, I have a quick question. I was intrigued when you said that Woodstock movie we missed out on about 15 minutes of music.
Oh, yeah.
And that was very influential in my music taste development, as you touched on in your talk yesterday. But I just wondered, what did we miss out on, and why? Was that because of contract rights, or was it the language in the songs or whatever?
I think it was actually nudity and pot smoking, is what I gather. I went through in the National Archives. You can look through the census records, and you can see exactly how many meters of film were cut out of these things. And there's usually some notes about what was taken out and why. And I think that, it was, things that were going to corrupt the minds of young New Zealanders. I'm sure it will look very tame now. But I think that's what went. I don't think it was, there would have been probably a musical soundtrack to that, but that was incidental. I don't think it was to do with music copyright.
Go on.
Nick, I was somebody who was in Jumping Sundays and was baton charged by the police outside the Intercontinental. You seem a couple of aspects you've mentioned about the counterculture that I think were particularly influential. One was the pill, and secondly was the growing demand by young people to have some say and authority in their life.
Yep.
And that was influential in the universities.
Yes.
There was big movements there, and that spread from there. Was that? I haven't read your book, but is that part of your book?
No, there is a chapter about the pill. Well, there is. No, that's I think well addressed there. I think you're absolutely right. And what was the other thing that you thought was
the growing influence of young people who wanted a say in their life and some influence against the establishment, as it were. There was the bomb, and Vietnam was particularly big, but there was also a movement to say, hey, we want a say in what's happening in our lives, and that hadn't been allowed up until the late 60s.
That's you articulate that really well. That was a sense, a sort of underlying feeling that I got from pretty much everyone I spoke to, and the various different things they were involved in, whether it was the protest movement or whether it was sexual liberation or drug taking. In a sense, it was saying, you haven't given us control over our lives, so we're taking it ourselves. We're just going to make the stand and do it anyway, whatever your laws are. Which is why it really did appear like a rebellion. It was it was.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that point to me is that two people who have been influential in different aspects, Winston Peters and Tim Shadbolt, both were at Auckland University at the same time at that period.
Oh, Winston was there, of course. He must have been keeping a very low profile, because I spent a lot of time going through the literature of the university magazines and things, and of course Shadbolt is quoted at every other page, and the name of Winston Peters does not appear.
He would have been wearing a suit, didn't he?
Yeah, I think the counterculture sort of bypassed him. But it is interesting. It was interesting to me that fourth Labour government that came in the mid-80s was the first time in New Zealand you had a cabinet made up substantially of baby boomers. They, Kegel and Preble and these people were all born after the war, and they would have been at university at that same time. They wouldn't have been much older than Shadbolt. And I wonder whether their ideas of freeing the economy and this free enterprise thing that they were pushing so strongly wasn't a sort of perverted version of the freedom that the counterculture was demanding, that there wasn't some odd sort of relationship there. In a way, it was the end of the counterculture and the beginning of individualism, but it interests me that they would have been there, and some of them were involved in certainly involved in anti-war protests and things like that. So
I don't think they smoked enough pot.
Maybe that was the problem.
Yeah.
Kia ora kōrua. I'm just wondering if you found much evidence in your research of any evidence of the counterculture here in Blenheim. I grew up here, local girl, was a teenager in the late 60s, early 70s, apart from my old school friend Stefan Browning, who might be here. Yeah. Oh, okay. Kia ora, Stefan. Sundays definitely didn't jump at all then. Maybe it's different now. I certainly had a feeling that to be part of anything that was happening on a national level, you really felt like you had to get out of Blenheim and kind of find a campus or some other site where national things were happening.
I think that's probably right, actually, that people came from all over the place, but they gravitated to places that were big enough to have a bit of critical mass, So it did kind of coalesce in places like Auckland, Wellington. I mean, Christchurch, there was quite a radical counter-political scene. That was one of the centres of this thing, the PYM, which I haven't mentioned, but John Bauer had been a member of that, the progressive youth movement. But it was a very fluid thing. It was basically a label that anyone could grab and use. So there was an Auckland PYM, who were essentially the junior branch of the Communist Party, but there was the Wellington PYM and the Christchurch PYM, which were more like the kind of Abbie Hoffman's yippies. They were, dope-smoking, free-loving anarchists, really. So, but they all called themselves the PYM. And I found an interview with a member of the PYM that was done, probably 1970, around this time, when they just placed a wreath on the Anzac Memorial on Anzac Day, commemorating, I think, the dead North Vietnamese. And this member of the PYM was, questioned by a reporter from the Dominion or the Evening Post, and said, the PYM is a state of mind. They've been asked, who are you? Who are your leaders?
So further to your question, I mean, the other interesting part, though, is with the rural areas in New Zealand, obviously Golden Bay, parts of the coast, the Coromandel, Northland, which were attracted, which were in their own way probably became centres. I mean, if you sit in the main street of Takaka in January, you'd think it still was the counterculture,
Yeah.
So it's, they still sort of hang in, don't they, in places, yeah.
And there were real tensions when they first, when these suburban dropouts first turned up in these rural areas.
Terrible.
The locals, what's all this?
Yeah. Now they've taken over. Yeah. It's interesting. Mm.
So, yes, rise and fall, but actually it's not over. A lot of it is actually mainstream things. I mean, and in that final chapter, which I don't think I've got time to read, but I do try and sort of enumerate some of the things that we just take for granted now that were truly countercultural in the 60s. I mean, even things like yoga classes and that was, you're a wacko if you were doing that in 1965,
Yeah. Or long hair. It's so easy to forget. All my education was ruined because I wanted long hair, and but so easy to forget what it was to see someone with long hair in 1968. It was like a man. Sorry,
it was the David Crosby song, you know, I'm going to let my freak flag fly, you know, that's the song, almost cut my hair. And it's true. It's hard to, it seems so sort of trivial now, but it was regarded as a matter of life and death. I'm not going to cut my hair, you know, because it was your way of signalling to the straight world and to the countercultural world who you were. You know, it was a banner of your identity. Yeah. It was a way of saying, I reject this, I'm with that.
Yeah. Hey, folks, well, we're out of time now. That's been absolutely fascinating. Please give it up for Nick. Yeah.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you all for coming out so early.
And can I please remind you that the next book is for sale out there, and he'll be available to sign it. So that was a wonderful way of supporting authors. So thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure.